Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fifth week of With Jewish Youth, a program that has won the hearts of our tremendous audience. We've been receiving some wonderful mail, and I suppose within the next few days or perhaps next week, I'll start reading some of this mail to you to give you an idea of some of the impressions that our broadcasts have made on our listeners. It seems that most of our people are very much impressed with the interviews that we have. In fact, they've told us about it, they've written to us about it, and they have called us and asked us to see if we cannot continue to have these interviews because they're very interesting, they're very fascinating, and some of the things that are brought out by these interviews from some of the very interesting guests that I have on my broadcast, their knowledge becomes enriched, and it sort of opens up a new world for them. And so today we also have a very interesting panelist, a very interested interviewee, that's the word, and she is Mrs. Chana Scharfstein. A very interesting woman. She has a degree, a Bachelor of Science in Elementary Education, Master of Science from Brooklyn College. She's her 6th year in Advanced Certificate in Language Arts. For 3 years has been the administrator and curriculum coordinator in the Beth Rivka schools. She's now working in the New York City public school system at Public School 167. She is the mother of 5 children, Kinahara, a wonderful wife to Rabbi Scharfstein. She is specialized in reading and language arts, active in the Lubavitch organization, especially their Speakers Bureau, and she is an author of numerous articles in the Yiddish Hecht. But besides that, she's also the author of 2 very wonderful books. I have asked Mrs. Scharfstein to be my guest tonight so that we can have an opportunity to speak about some of her works and some of the new revelations that she has made in the field of education. She has written 2 books. The books are called The Call of the Shofar, and the other is called The Secret of Success. These are reading books illustrated for 3rd and 4th year grade children. They are very attractive books. They've been published by the Merkaz L'Inyonei Chinuch, which is the Lubavitcher arm of their educational system. And she has become very popular because of these books. These books are used in many, many Jewish homes. And we are trying to see to it, if it wouldn't be possible, to get these books into the yeshiva system. Mrs. Scharfstein, welcome to With Jewish Youth. We are certainly glad that the busy lady that you are, you had time to come and spend this half hour with us to tell our audience something about yourself, about the work that you've been doing, besides all the household chores that every Yiddish mama, Yiddish wife has. Nevertheless, you found time to write these wonderful books. Would you be good enough, first, before we go into the depth of it, tell us something about these books. How did you come to write them? What sort of prompted you to get these books out?
First of all, Rabbi Hecht, thank you very much for inviting me to come to this program. I'm most fascinated by it, and I wish you a great deal of success on it. I'm sure that you're fulfilling a very great need in the community in New York City. About these books, about 2 years ago, I was contacted by the Merkaz L'Inyonei Chinuch that they were starting a program. They felt there was a dire need, and I believe it still exists, in suitable reading material for children of 3rd and 4th grade reading level who are reading independently and who are interested in learning about life around them, to give them an authentic picture of Jewish values, which we have tried to do through these books. These stories, incidentally, Rabbi Hecht, are not my own. These are old-time folk tales that I adapted. I simplified the vocabulary and the sentence structure so that a young child should be able to read it independently. And through these books, we hope that we can deepen the child's understanding and appreciation of the Jewish way of life.
This I can understand, but tell me, why did they pick you? That's part one of my question. I usually like to place my questions in 2 parts. And the second question that I have to you is, what did you accomplish in this book that wasn't accomplished in the story? If you say you've just adapted these stories, what did this book do for the story that the story didn't have before you made the book?
I think quite a bit. First of all, the format. Have you noticed how attractive the book is?
This I've seen, and I think people should know about this. I'm sorry that we haven't got television, but these are books with pictures, living pictures, beautifully designed. I believe that the author here was Zalman Kleiman, who is one of the world's, yes, he's one of the finest artists that I know in this day and age. But besides that,
well, the vocabulary was very difficult in the original stories. They had words that were really not suitable for a child of that reading level. The concepts were very difficult. I take nothing for granted. If, for example, I mention a certain mitzvah, hachnases kala, which means to help a young bride get married, to provide her with suitable furnishings for a home, to help her get settled, I explain this in detail. The first story in the first book, The Call of the Shofar, I mention a shofar. I do not take for granted that a child knows what a shofar is, but I explain that this is the horn of a ram, that we use this on Rosh Hashanah to usher in the new year, so that a child totally unacquainted with the Jewish way of life would have no difficulty in reading these books and understanding any concepts that he meets.
So now I understand why you didn't have to answer the other part of the question, why they chose you, because you seem to have this creative and imaginative power to be able to sort of understand the child's mind, to anticipate what the child would have to know and doesn't know, that, as you quoted, take it for granted. You don't take anything for granted as far as the child is concerned. And so when the child is through reading one of your stories and seeing the pictures that go along with it, that child would know exactly what this story is all about. Mr. Scharfstein, tell me, by the way, you have many, many stories in these two books of yours. Which is your favorite story?
I believe the story about the mirror is really my favorite. And interestingly enough, I think most of these stories, if they're read by an adult, would also carry across a message, though it is written on a child's level. The story of the mirror, I'm sure Rabbi Hecht is acquainted with it, is a story about a man, Abraham, in a small town in Poland, a simple man who has a little home and a little store, but has a very kind and generous heart. He's very compassionate, concerned for his fellow Jew. He's always ready to help them with money. There's always enough food for a stranger, and so on. One time, a very famous rabbi comes to the village and becomes very much impressed with Abraham's way of life, and he blesses him with great fortune so that he should become very rich to be able to do ever so much more for his community. Time passes by, and one time the rabbi has a difficult situation in his community, so he sends one of his students to call on Abraham to ask for help. And at this point, Abraham lives in a very beautiful home surrounded by his riches, and he no longer is interested in letting strangers cross his threshold. He doesn't want his house to get dirtied up. He is not interested anymore. He spends all of his time acquiring more material wealth, and he no longer has all this concern for the people around him. And the student returns to the rabbi with this message, whereupon the rabbi travels to Abraham's home to come to visit him. And Abraham is very happy to see him and proudly shows him his beautiful home. And one of his dearest things that he has, a mirror that hangs on the wall, a very elaborate, decorated mirror. The rabbi then asks him, "Look into the mirror, and what do you see?" And of course, Abraham sees his own reflection, his beautiful clothing, the elegant furnishings of his home, his drapes, the staircase that goes up, and so on. The rabbi then takes him to the window, and he says, "Look out, Abraham, and what do you see?" And Abraham then notices a poor widow walking down the street who's been struggling ever since her husband died. He sees an old man who has been sick most of the winter, is unable to find work, and can't support his growing family. And the rabbi then points out that essentially the mirror and the window are made of the same material, except that the mirror has a silver backing. And because of this silver backing, he's unable to see anything beyond. This being, like Abraham, surrounded by his wealth, is so engrossed in his material acquisitions, he no longer cares about his fellow man. Do you know the end of the story, Rabbi Hecht? Would you like to tell that?
No, you just continue. You're doing a fine job.
Well, the end of the story, he takes a knife and he scrapes off a corner of the silver backing to make it as clear as the pane of glass in the window, so that forever after he should be reminded of his fellow Jews, and he should remember that there are people outside that need him.
Okay, that was beautiful. You know, I've used this many a time in my sermon, so that's the reason I didn't want to sort of barge in on you. But I believe that this story is not only, as you said before, for children, but there are many, many adults should really try to learn the lesson from the mirror that you're trying to convey to the children. It's good to get this inculcated and imbued into the child when the child is still young, so that when the child grows up, we won't have the kind of problems that you had with Abraham. Well, I could very well understand now why these books are making such tremendous headway, and why I know you're working on your third book. So we'll be looking for that one when it comes to press. But in the meanwhile, I also have knowledge that you have developed some new innovative techniques in teaching. You first introduced these in the Beth Rivka Primary School, and I know that they've made a hit, and they're becoming very famous amongst other educators and in other school systems. Would you be good enough to tell my radio audience something about these new discoveries that you have made and these new techniques that you've introduced into the educational system?
Through my extensive graduate studies in the field of reading, I became very much aware of the difficulties that are encountered by some children, the problems of mirror writing, of reversals, and serious difficulties that hamper their progress in reading. I worked as a remedial reading teacher for the Board of Education, and I also worked in Kings County on a case study of a child that had severe problems. In addition to all that, of course, thank God I am a mother, and watching the progress of my own children gives me a very intimate knowledge of problems that can be encountered by a child in a yeshiva. I don't know, Rabbi Hecht, whether you ever thought of the difficulties that a 5.5-year-old child has when they enter first grade in a yeshiva and are exposed to two sets of symbols, the Hebrew and the English alphabet, and in addition to that, to further complicate matters, the directionality, the opposite movement from left to right and right to left.
You see, I was a genius child, I suppose, so I can't remember having these difficulties, but since you're speaking about the general rule, continue.
Well, I bet Rebitz and Hecht would verify that there is some truth to what I say. I wonder who helped the children with the homework, Rabbi Hecht.
You can be sure that I never did.
Okay.
I never had the time for them, never.
But I believe really that parents often are not aware of these things, because one must really study the theory to understand that there is more to it. It seems that we take for granted that our children will succeed, but I believe very much that an ounce of prevention can be very important. So what we did, we had the children bring milk containers to school that they covered with construction paper. On these milk containers, they put a red circle and a green circle, and these were traffic lights. We used this then for a lesson on safety in crossing streets and the meaning of red and green rather, the green for go and the red for stop. And then in our kindergarten and pre-1A, every label that we had Delis on the door and door in English, or we had Luach on the blackboard and blackboard, or on the cubbies where the children keep their things, they have their Hebrew and English names tacked on. For the first letter in whichever language we wrote, we used green, and the last letter was always red. So by the time the children were ready to enter first grade, they automatically knew that you move from green to red in whichever language it was. And even if they didn't know all the symbols, at least the directionality was constantly reinforced. And gradually they began to associate the movement from right to left with the Hebrew letters and the movement from left to right with the English letters. And this was continued on the bulletin boards, on any signs that the teachers made in first grade as well. And then when it came to writing in first grade, the children sometimes would ask, where do we begin? And they might write a whole line backwards. We had them put a green dot in the upper right-hand corner when they were doing Hebrew, a green dot in the upper left-hand corner when they were doing English. And through this color coding, I really believe that we can prevent the problems of reversals for a lot of children.
Sounds fantastic, and I bet it must work too. The way you've presented it, it's really sort of simplifies the whole educational teaching system. I think the teacher will end up with a lot of less headaches than she or he would if they didn't have this system. I could very well see why this becomes such a popular new technique or a new program of teaching for children. Mrs. Scharfstein, you know, I'm also in the educational field now over 30 years, and I remember once upon a time when I was yet a teacher in the classroom for little children. And from that very day on, I have always had this hang-up when parents came and sort of ate my heart out, telling me that their child doesn't have to learn so much Hebrew because it interferes with the progress of the secular studies, and they always try to play the Hebrew studies down, especially when a child was very successful in his Hebrew studies. And they always seem to have found so many more important things for the child to do, and the only thing that was bothering him was the fact that the Hebrew studies was getting in their way. Well, I think today parents are getting to be a little smarter. They're beginning to realize and understand the terrible mistakes that some of the parents of the past 20 or 30 years have made. I do hope that their eyes and their heads are open to this now. But I believe you must have something positive to say about this. And how did you find, since you've majored in this area, do you find that Hebrew studies really interferes with the progress in the child's secular studies?
I think that's a very important and valid question to ask, Rabbi Hecht, and one that really concerns parents, especially those sending a child into a yeshiva to first grade. I don't know whether you've ever seen this article that I wrote in the Yiddish Heim, which is a women's magazine, but I believe a lot of men read it nevertheless. It's published also by the Merkez L'Inyonej Chinuch. We seem to feel, as yeshiva parents believing in a yeshiva education, that the Hebrew program does not interfere. But I wanted to be a bit more scientific about the whole thing and not take it for granted. So 2 years in a row, at the end of the pre-1A, which is the grade preceding the first grade, we gave the children the Metropolitan Readiness Test. This is a very valid and reliable, highly approved of test. And I really believe this is interesting because in every single test there's a certain amount of chance. But what happened when we did the testing was really too much to be able to say that it was a chance. Part of the test, the children have to recognize alphabet letters. They have to match letters. There are letters out in one column, and then they have to choose one that matches among 4. We found that in that particular test, and this is a very important readiness part for reading, 95% of our children placed 90 and above, which is the superior category, which was really fantastic. Then there was another part which is called copying. The children look at an abstract design, and then they have to copy this particular design. This depends very much on visual discrimination, visual acuity, to be able to look at something and see all the details, and then to be able to put it down in writing. This, again, is an indication whether the child is ready to read. And again, we found the fantastic results. 95% of our children were in the 90 and above superior category. For matching, this is a test where the children match an entire word, such as telephone, and then they might have the word elephant, and then they might have television and telephone. They circle the two that match. Again, these splendid results. And I drew the conclusion that the studies in Hebrew, learning the Hebrew symbols, only reinforced the studies in English. It brought about a keener awareness of letters and shapes, and it brightened up the child that much more and placed the child in a higher category. You know, in educational philosophy, we talk about the transfer of learning from one area to another. So what they studied in Hebrew actually strengthened them in their English.
Very good. Of course, you know, I believe that if more parents would take the advice that we give them, if they would only listen to us and try these things out that they hear, maybe then they too would agree that we are right. See, one of the big problems that we have is not with the child, it's with the parent. The parent seems to have the feeling that they know it all, and because they didn't have what we want to give the child today, they feel that the child shouldn't have it because we're going to upset the child, so to speak, upset in quotation marks. The only upsetness that we can have for the child is that this child will come out far superior to his parents. And sometimes I begin to think that the Gemara tells us that parents are not envious of children, but I think some of these parents that I meet up with are very, very scared that their kids may know a lot more than they know today. And that's one of the reasons why they hold back, and they try to sort of keep it down to a minimum. He shouldn't know too much as far as Hebrew goes, because he may confront his parents with a question or two and they won't know the answer, or he may show them up, or he may do a little bit more in his everyday practice of Jewish living. And they don't do it, so there again they're put up against the wall and they become very embarrassed. This is, of course, a very foolish approach. If they had any brains, they would understand how important it is to see to it that the child today should get the most and the best, so that they will have a little nachis and they won't have to worry about the problems and heartaches that so many parents come with as these children develop into their mature years. Mr. Scharfstein, this has been a very interesting conversation, but I don't want to let you go yet. I have one other very important question that I would like to speak to you about. I know that you're the author, and you mentioned this before, of articles in the Yiddish Heim, and you have also been doing some other writing, not only for the Yiddish Heim, but for, I know there's an article that's now being prepared to be published in the magazine called The Principle by the Board of Jewish Education, which I know is going to be a very interesting article. Would you be good enough to give us sort of an advance indication as to what this article is all about?
How about the title, Rabbi Hecht? Does that shock you? Integration in the yeshiva.
You bet your sweet life it shocks me. I was so shocked I was afraid to use it.
I kind of thought that would bring about some sort of a reaction. You seem to avoid it. Well, actually, what I'm talking about is integration of subject matter within the curriculum. I'm a firm believer that in education we must consider the whole child. We can't departmentalize the child and say, now we're teaching him Hebrew language, now we're teaching him to read the Siddur, now we're teaching him laws and customs. In the afternoon, we're teaching him 30 minutes of math, 40 minutes of language arts, 35 minutes of reading, and so on. We're not compartmentalized. We are human beings, and we think and act in a complete entity. I believe very firmly that Hebrew and English departments within a yeshiva should cooperate and work together for the welfare of the child to bring about a more complete understanding of whatever he's studying. I did something very interesting when it came to Pesach, for example. Could I discuss that?
Gladly, no problem.
Fine. Well, I felt that when the children were learning about Pesach, and I'm sure you'll agree, Rabbi Hecht, you take a 5-6-year-old child and teach them the manishtana, the questions they ask at the Seder table. And you tell them to ask the question about chametz and matzah, why we do not eat chametz on Pesach and we only eat matzah. And even if you translate it and you say leavened and unleavened bread, aren't these very strange concepts for a child? Rabbi Hecht, what do you think?
Well, I know, I must confess, I never knew what leaven and unleavened bread. But I was a very good student, as you heard before. I was a genius. So when the Rabbi taught me leavened and unleavened, I said leavened and unleavened. But really, I must confess that I never knew, and I don't think the child today who is young, perhaps 5, 6, or 7, or 8 years old, knows it. All right, so tell me, how do you solve this problem?
All right. I believe even the child of 9 and 10 might find this a bit strange. So in science, we worked out in our English curriculum to have the children prepare dough with and without yeast. And the children left this on the radiator for the whole afternoon. At the end of the afternoon, they actually examined the bread for texture to see which one had gotten bigger, to feel the difference, that the chametz was much softer, that the leavened dough had a different feel, was puffed up. They could understand that in order to make chametz bread, you need time. You have to put it away and let it rise. That the matzah made no difference. It was just the same flat piece of dough that you put in the beginning. So I believe that when the children discussed chametz and matzah at the Seder table, it meant something to them. They could understand the matzah being baked in haste because you could not wait for it to rise. Now, in the same kind of way, in math, for example, instead of discussing how many apples we would buy, we discussed how many pounds of matzah a family needs. If each person needs 10 pieces of matzah for the number of days of Pesach, how many would a family of 5 need? If a pound of matzah costs $2.50, and that's shmura matzah, so the people shouldn't get scared, how much would you pay for about 3 pounds, let's say? In reading, we dropped the actual reading program, the open court reading program, and we read stories about Pesach. Some of them were teacher prepared, some were stories about Mendel the Mouse, other publications. And again, we had a reinforcement of what the children were learning in the Hebrew department. And this strengthened them in their Hebrew studies. There was more understanding of what was going on there. We discussed the concept of freedom in English, of freedom, the basis of the American society, of why this country was built, for example, in context with the freedom, the slavery in Egypt, how difficult it was for the Jews, what a difficult life they had, how much we cherish freedom. We had the children in creative writing, write articles, and I wish you could see some of them, Rabbi Hecht. They wrote, if I were a matzah, how I would have felt being put into the oven. If I were a bottle of wine and I was standing on that table, red and sparkly. And the children really used their imagination, and it was beautiful. Through all these experiences, Pesach became alive to them. And through this entire working together of the English and Hebrew departments, they both strengthened each other, and the English teachers really loved the fact that they could imbue a Jewish feeling in the child through the secular studies. And the Hebrew department, of course, loved the fact that whatever they were teaching the children was much more meaningful and much more real to them.
Mrs. Scharfstein, it's been a pleasure, but as I always say, we have a wicked, wicked sign. It's a clock, and it doesn't let you work as much as you would like to. The half hour is practically gone, and I'm sorry that we have to end this very interesting, colorful conversation, but I do hope we're going to have you back in one of our later programs. It's been a pleasure having you with us. It's been very enlightening and very educational, and I'm sure that there may be many of our listeners who would be very interested in perhaps getting your books or perhaps learning more about your system or getting some of your articles. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you wish to communicate with Mrs. Scharfstein, you may through our office. All you have to do is write to Mrs. Chana Scharfstein, care of With Jewish Youth, either care of this station, WEVD 1700 Broadway, New York City, or care of With Jewish Youth, 824 Eastern Parkway, Brooklyn, New York. The telephone number is 778-4600. I should like to ask you, those who are listening in, if you wish to write to us, if you have any special problems or questions or any subjects that you would like to have us discuss, feel free to suggest them to us, and if it's only possible, we'll be very glad to have these guests on the air. We have planned a very interesting week of ladies and gentlemen, and you're going to have some very beautiful programs coming up. In the meanwhile, all that I could say to you is, those of you who are encouraged, interested, and fascinated with this new challenge and approach of the National Committee for Furtherance of Jewish Education, why don't you try to help us, not only with your moral support, but also with your financial support, by contributing to the National Committee for Furtherance of Jewish Education, a tax-deductible organization 824 Eastern Parkway, Brooklyn, New York. Telephone 778-4600. We'll be grateful to you for anything that you could do for us. Until tomorrow at the same time, may God bless you all.